Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here. I think we have broken our record for attendance of parents in this meeting because I just gave away my last handout. That has never happened before. So bravo to you for being here. We really appreciate you being here and for participating in the many information sessions we have to offer. I'm Tamara Felden. I'm the director of the Office of International Affairs. So your son or daughter has been working with us with email, getting documents, and so on. You may have had questions, so we're a little bit familiar already. And we will see your student on Thursday morning for an orientation session specifically for our new international students. And we greatly look forward to that. So we finally see everyone in person. We know many names. We may know how to spell them. We may not yet know how to pronounce them, but your son or daughter will teach us to do that, and we greatly look forward to that. So this is a very exciting time on the campus. In summer, it gets very quiet here, and at this time, it looks like a campus again. There are students in groups talking with each other, playing Frisbee, doing the many kinds of things, and of course, having many orientation sessions. So the handout that I've just given you is not totally comprehensive. It addresses those kinds of things that we have typically gotten questions about, and a few things that we feel we should let you know about at this point in time. And so obviously, we are reachable. Your son and daughter will hear a lot from us. We send a lot of email to our incoming students, and so they should have good information, but there are some things that are particularly relevant to parents and some things that may be on your mind at this time. And one of the things we will talk about is winter in Chicago. How many of you come from a region of the world where it never gets really cold? And when I say really cold, I mean really cold. All right. So the handout talks about that a little bit because one of the things your children will do soon is shop to prepare for winter, and we'll get to that in a little bit. As you know, our immigration system is somewhat complicated and can be frustrating. My office strives to very much support students in such a way that they understand what they need to do to control their situation. We want to empower them to be able to manage things with our help. And so we will send them email messages indicating if this particular circumstance applies to you, we need you to do X, Y, or Z. So as long as they pay attention to our office's email and do what the email instructs them specifically to do, they should be fine. So it's a complicated system, but we had more than 3,500 international students enrolled in the university last year, undergraduate, graduate, and professional school students. And in most instances, that works very nicely, and there are very few problems. So as long as we collaborate, as long as students are aware if something important changes in their circumstance, they should check with us. If nothing needs to be done, then they have peace of mind. If something does need to be done, then we can give them instructions, we can guide them. We have a team of international student advisors who work with our students ongoingly. Typically, your student will see the same advisor every time. We can do appointments in person, we can do appointments through Skype, over the phone. A lot of business these days is done by email, where a student sends us a question and we indicate here is what needs to happen, or everything is fine, or let's have a conversation. And so that works fairly smoothly. So the fact that someone is from another country in the US does not mean that your student will inherently have a bad experience. Most of our students have a very smooth experience with all of this. It's just something to pay attention to. And attached to that bureaucracy are other pieces. There will be email next spring that talks about tax reporting, and many young people have never dealt with taxes in their home country, let alone in the US. And obviously we have help with that. We have software, we have advisement, and so on. We have a lot of mechanisms to help with those pieces of bureaucracy that are connected somehow to immigration matters. We communicate in a number of ways. We have a weekly digest that tells students about things that are happening on campus that may be of interest. There are certain things that they can subscribe to if they're interested. We also have an international student list that they cannot unsubscribe from. So, so they have no choice but to get our email. Their choice ultimately is whether to read it, but they typically do read it. And so we want you to be aware of that. They cannot hide. We have a variety of programs for students. We have workshops. We have events. We collaborate a lot with other offices and with their programs across the university. So the choice that a student has to make is not so much, is there something that I can attend? But their choice usually is, what do I focus on, because there are so many things available. And they very quickly get a handle on that. Certainly the students who've been here for a year or two have good tips for them. We have an international student advisory board, and roughly half of the members of that board are undergraduates. We currently have 21 members. And so there is a lot of activism there in that the ISAB functions as an advocate for international students in the university with other students. They communicate with us and give us a sense what is important right now for international students, what are students talking about, what are the issues where students collectively need help and support. And there are quite a number of entities in the university that help students be advocates for their concerns. The advisory board is going to be quite present to them. They will hear about that on Thursday at orientation and a number of other things. And so that's an additional way in which they can reach in and voice a concern and collectively discuss what kinds of things can student bodies do in addition to what my office does and what other offices do in supporting them. A lot of the things that we hear from students early on have to do with what happens with my visa when it expires. And then a lot of students are thinking ahead of when I want employment, how does all of that happen? And we tend to get questions from parents about that as well. So the first thing that is important for you to know, your son or daughter must be enrolled full-time at all times, except for the summer, which is the vacation quarter. And that means if there is an emergency, for example, if somebody were sick or we had a student go skiing during winter break and break a leg, and so that student couldn't attend classes for some time, we have mechanisms to deal with that, but a student cannot choose to be enrolled less than full-time, and of course the college has its own policies, academic policies, that work with that. So that is the first thing to be conscious of, and then the visa in your student's passport, it is perfectly okay if that expires. The piece that cannot expire is the I-20 or DS-2019 that your student holds. So we sometimes get questions. There are still a few countries in the world where the visa is issued for a relatively short period of time. And we sometimes get a question from a student saying, my visa is going to expire. Do I have to leave the US to get a new visa? No. The visa is exactly the same thing as the key to your house. When you're in the house, you have no use for the key. When you're leaving the house and you want to come back into the house, that's when you need to have the key along, right? So if a student has an expired visa and the student is leaving the US, whether that's for break or for study abroad or whatever the case may be, then the student has to make sure that he or she has a valid visa by the time he or she wants to come back into the US. But in the meantime, while the student is in the US, whether the visa is valid or not is irrelevant. And that can be a little bit confusing because most people think of visas as, I apologize, this humidity really gets to me. And so most students have absolutely no issues with that. For one, many visas are now issued for longer periods of time. And if a student has an expired visa and is going home for vacation, we always say, when you get home, apply for the visa so that early on during your vacation time, you get the new visa, and then you re-enter the US, and there is no problem. If things get a little bit more complex, obviously we'll meet with the student and we'll advise. And of course, if any of you are from Canada, you may be aware that Canadian citizens do not require a visa, but they require the I-20 or DS 2019. So they have one less step in the process. While your student is here on-campus employment is something that a student can engage in up to a maximum of 20 hours per week. And that is something that doesn't require additional, any kind of particular authorization. So if your student has a job in the library, or there is maybe a research job in a program that the student is interested in, or if your student is going to do a Metcalf, and I'll get to that. So there are certain things that are connected directly to the university that happen here that do not require authorization, and it's one of the things that we're going to go over on Thursday. However, if your student is going to be employed away from campus through either, let's say, a summer internship, that is something that requires authorization. A lot of college students compete for the Metcalf internships, and we automatically do curricular practical training authorization for those internships. Now, what does that mean? That's one of these bureaucratic language pieces. It means that the student is engaging in something that is directly related to the student's field of study. In other words, there is practical experience happening in connection with the theoretical studies the student is undertaking, and that is an authorization that my office issues, so that is not something that has to be provided by the US government. So a student who is doing a Metcalf internship, there is a very automated process by which we get some paperwork, we issue that student a new DS 2019 or I-20 that shows that the student is authorized for this internship, and there is nothing else the student needs to do. However, the student cannot engage in an internship without such authorization, and that's very important. And then there is the opportunity, maybe for a rising fourth year, a lot of our students will find internships across the country and do a lot of interesting things. They may need authorization for optional practical training, OPT, and that is something that you may have heard of. That is a longer process, and that makes it quite difficult. We also have a lot of students who, after graduation, want to be employed under OPT, and that is available for up to a year. So that's a wonderful first step into employment life and into a career if a student doesn't immediately go on to graduate school. Optional practical training has to be authorized by the US government, and you guessed correctly if you thought that it costs money and takes time. That is unfortunately the way government entities work. There is a fee, and the student applies. It takes approximately 3 to 5 months before the authorization is received, and it first comes in the form of a document and then in the form of an identification card that shows that the student is allowed to engage in this kind of employment. The difficulty with that is the student does not need to know yet who the employer will be. So if your student is about to graduate and says, I plan to be employed in the US after I graduate, the student typically will have to apply fairly early in that calendar year. We start talking to students about authorization in January and February of the year when they graduate. So it's not even the beginning of the spring term, it's early in the winter quarter that they have to think about it. The difficulty with that is they don't know yet whether they're going to have a job, right? So the timeline of the job search does not align well with the timeline of the authorization process. That's a time when we have a lot of conversations with students who come to us and say, I would like to be employed, I don't have a job yet. If I start job hunting now, I have to say I cannot start until the middle of June. And of course, I have to somehow make all of these timelines fit together. That tends to be a fairly complicated piece. And so that is one of the challenges that they will face a little later on. But in the meantime, summer internships are quite straightforward. And so the Metcalfs are a wonderful opportunity for our students, and so that runs a little bit more smoothly. But that gives you a sense that further along the way, that is one of the things we will have a lot of communication with them about. When I do the orientation on Thursday morning, we talk a lot about not being employed without authorization. And the tricky part is most students think of employment as a very formal job, right? They interview and somebody wants to hire them and it's a regular position, but employment can be all sorts of things. We've had a student start a thriving coffee shop enterprise several years ago from his dorm room. We have startups, we have just a lot of interesting things happening. Students do the breadth of things, and we're always amazed at their ingenuity and innovative spirit. And within that, sometimes somebody might say, hey, I'm starting a company. We're doing this. You want in? And of course, the student says, yes, how exciting. Well, those are the kinds of things where one can slip into something that is considered employment, even though it doesn't look that way. And so that's one of the things that we're going to talk about a lot, to say, here is what we're talking about when we say employment, and it can never be fixed later. In other words, we have to get the immigration piece right up front, because if we don't, then there are negative consequences that we don't want. And one rule in immigration law in the US is, if we do something different now, there is no opportunity to fix it later. Fixing something would usually mean that the student has to leave the US, get a new visa with a new I-20 from us, come back in, and so on, and that's highly disruptive. So we obviously want to avoid that. So we have a lot of conversations around employment. There are certain things that are difficult, Social Security numbers. Many of your students are probably in the process of working with my office this week and soon after to get what we call an individual taxpayer identification number that gives them the tax number that they need to receive their stipends and so on. So there is a fair bit of bureaucracy involved in the early days as they're settling into their time here as students. We're fully aware of that. We have structures in place. If they don't know about it, we certainly do, and we walk them through it, and we have the services set up. And so all of that should go relatively smoothly. It makes for a very busy time. Orientation week is a really busy time. I've had students say to me, I'm so glad classes are starting. Orientation is just too exhausting, right? And for you to have been in orientation probably all day already, you probably can appreciate that. So we help with taxes, with Social Security numbers, with driver's licenses, and so on. There is a lot of information on our website and generally on the university's website. We have on the International Student Affairs site under Daily Life a lot of information that has to do with banking and housing and just a lot of the things that are the day-to-day pieces of life that have to come together that are not academic in nature. Obviously, students learn a lot about the resources they have available in the university in this orientation week, but we also make sure that we continue to follow up. So when we interact with the student and we find here's a particular resource that would be helpful, we connect the student with that resource. And it's just really difficult to come to so complex an institution as this as a new student and to understand what all is available. So one of the things I tell students in email, in orientation, any opportunity I get, if you have a question, it is really important to ask. I come from a culture where being polite is very important and not imposing on people is important. And so I know that it can be difficult to say, I'm not exactly sure what I'm asking or how I need to ask it, but here's something that I'm trying to do and I don't know how. It is always, always, always okay, and we actually urge them to contact us with questions. It's difficult to know who does what in the university, and here's my situation, and to whom should I talk? If we're not the ones to resolve the issue, then we certainly know to whom to connect the student. We don't want students to have to go and shop from administrator to get the help they need. We want them to come to us and we can say, I forwarded your message to this person and you should hear a response very soon. That is the expert, or that is the person in charge of that to help you. So always, always, always ask for help. One of the things I point out to them, if students didn't need help, my office would probably not exist. We really want them to support us, right? So they should drop by, they should email us, they should contact us in whatever way is comfortable. One of the things that sometimes comes up is, here is a complicated travel plan or something like that, and a student has visa issues to plan for that connect with maybe your travel issues. Maybe you have a trip planned to some part of the world. The student needs a visa for there, maybe has questions about the visa here. And sometimes I get a call from a parent saying, so I need to talk through my son's or daughter's visa situation because we have this plan. There is something in the US called the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and it's abbreviated FERPA, and there's a little blurb in here. It is a piece of law that is very counterintuitive to many cultures around the world. I have adult children, and I feel that when they were in college, I had a right to know what they were doing. However, once they're 18 years old, and I assume all your sons and daughters are of that age by now, they are considered legal adults, and we cannot share certain information about them with anybody, and that includes their parents. And I know that's a very difficult piece of news to get, which is not to say nobody will talk to you about your child. But if, for example, there are questions about immigration status and so on, that is really confined to the person whose immigration status it is. And so if there is some planning to be done, or if there's a conversation to be had, what we will say to the student is, if your parents need to be in this conversation, let's do a conference call so we have you, or you can send us an email message saying it's okay to freely share with my parents, and the student would give us the names, any information about me that they're asking for, but we have to have the student's permission to do so. Obviously, if there is an emergency of some sort, you would not be contacted by our office, but by the office of the Dean of Students in the university, and you probably are aware of that office by now, so they have an entire Dean of Students and support operation in the college that focuses very much on them and that would interact in the case of an emergency. Fortunately, we don't have that many of those. Most things that we see are just day-to-day life in a university, but it's important to be aware that if you contact us and we tell you we can't answer your question and we're directing your students to have a conversation with you, that we're not being obstructionist. On the positive side, this is designed, obviously, to protect your student from unwarranted intrusion. Unfortunately, you're aware the world is full of identity theft, scams, trying to defraud people of money, and so on. So we're very, very careful. Not only are you not receiving some of this information, but others are not either. So we carefully protect the privacy of the students, and we have not seen that be a problem. There has been the occasional case where we were in a conference call, we had the student and the parent and maybe an academic advisor, depending on what plans we were trying to align or what problem we were trying to solve, or a student sent us a message saying, yes, you can discuss all of that with my parents, that's perfectly fine. But I want you to be aware that there is such a construct, because when it suddenly comes unawares, it's kind of startling, and it is counterintuitive, because in many countries we don't have that kind of legislation. We have a number of on-campus resources, and before you leave today, I hope you will stop at the front table. I've brought a supply of my business cards. However, if there are not enough, because we definitely have broken the record today. I have never had almost every chair taken in this room before, so bravo to you. If you do not get a business card, I am easily findable on the university's website. So if you go to the Office of International Affairs, you will find my information there, and you will find our contact information. There also is a set of cards, and there's a small set in English, there's a set in Mandarin, and a set in Spanish, and we're working on several other languages. And it's a very important resource, and it is one that international students tend not so much to seek out. And that is our student counseling service. Because students in counseling and mental health are very different things across the globe. In some countries, that is something that is very common and readily used. In some countries, it's really not that way. And even in this country, we still struggle with some issues. When we say counseling, most people think, uh-oh, I'm not crazy, I'm okay. But that's not what we're talking about. We're really talking about something that is a support mechanism in what I think of as life coaching. So the kinds of conversations counselors are prepared to have is, I think I need to talk to my professor, and I think I need to go to office hour, and I'm nervous about that, I'm not really sure how to do that. Or, I somehow am not staying on top of my studies, I have a difficult time focusing. Sometimes students are homesick. Sometimes there's a lot of new stuff coming at them, right? It's a big adjustment. It may be a matter of, my roommate is driving me crazy, and I'm not exactly sure what to do. It could be all sorts of day-to-day things. So we don't think of that service as inherently something not being right with the student. We're thinking of it as something where we're saying there is a lot of new stuff happening. There are a lot of adjustments. And I have gone from one culture to another. I'm an immigrant in this country. It's a difficult thing to do, especially when you have top-notch academic requirements to meet and so on. So the counselors are there to have very easy conversations. There are some mechanisms. There is something called Let's Talk, which means that counselors are at certain locations on campus at certain times, and a student can just walk in, doesn't have to give a name, doesn't have to, formally step into a system, but just say, I'm just going a little crazy today because here are all these kinds of things, or here is something that I'm trying to resolve. One of the things that can be hard is being in an American classroom for the first time. One of the earliest things we focus on is, how do you get into that discussion? American students tend to be very assertive. They speak up, they get into debates. For many of our international students, the notion of speaking up in the classroom and disagreeing with the professor is a very difficult concept, right? But that's part of what we do, having lively debate, making a good argument, applying our critical thinking. And so it's really, really important that they have all the resources we could possibly give them for that. And that is the program that Student Counseling has created. This year, they have made it their strategic focus to develop resources for international students to the absolute best level they can bring it. And there are a whole lot of mechanisms that they're putting in place for this year. And so I feel it's a very, very good resource. And we will try to help students understand, no, it's not that something is wrong with you. There is somebody who is not your dean or your professor or your TA, but here's somebody who has no concern other than how can you best manage all of this, and they are readily available for that purpose. Which brings us to surviving the Chicago winter. We had one year, a few years ago, when I told the students in the orientation how cold it would be, and how much snow there would be, and how much ice they would encounter, and how dark it would be. And we had the mildest winter ever, and I lost all credibility with that cohort. However, by now I think they believe me again. It does get cold, it does snow, there is ice. It gets dark early, and so on. And for those who come from climates where, somebody who comes from certain areas in Canada and certain other areas of the world, you're probably going, oh, we know how that goes, right? We're prepared for that. For many, this is a new experience. So one thing that we try to get our students to understand is, for one thing, have fun. When there is snow and ice, go ice skating, build a snowman, do all the crazy things that US kids in winter situations grow up with. And then when you're cold, go and have hot chocolate together with your friends and, hang out, spend some time and talk about what you did. There are a lot of things to do in the city of Chicago all year round, but including in winter. So we want to get the message across. Don't stay in your room and feel it's too dark and cold to leave the building. Go out there and do things with it. And it is really, there is a lot of fun to be had. But it requires some preparation. It requires some adequate clothing. It requires particular attention to eating well, exercising, getting enough sleep, the kinds of things that we want students to do anyway. And so since students will undoubtedly contact you saying, I need more money because I have to buy things, there are some certain things that students will indeed need to prepare for winter, and we've created a little bit of a list there on how they can prepare. At the bottom of the third page where it says Surviving the Chicago Winter, there are some ways in which they can set their dorm room up most helpfully. It gets very, very dry, and so they will experience some new things. For example, when I come into my office in the winter, the door locks and the keys are brass. And when it gets really, really dry and the static builds up, the moment your key touches the lock, there's a spark, right? And so there are things that those who are not familiar with a cold winter have probably not experienced. But in their houses, they will also do a lot of things together. There's a lot of good advice from the continuing students who've been here through a winter, and there is indeed a lot of fun to be had. So dressing in multiple layers is essential. I had a student, actually many years ago, before I came to the University of Chicago, who came from Venezuela, and he arrived for our second term. He arrived in January. And it was a very cold winter. And he came to my office, and he was so unhappy. And he said, I made a terrible mistake. I have to go home. And I said, what happened? And he said, it's so cold. And I said, well, there are things you can do about that. And we had a video that showed how to layer and how to do all of those kinds of things. And he had come in with a light shirt and a thin windbreaker. And the next day he came back and he said, I'm still very cold. And I said, well, you're still just wearing a light shirt and a windbreaker. And so I had several conversations with him over several days. And my office mate was the director of the ESL program, and so she interacted with international students a lot. And she and I both had adult sons who no longer lived at home, but we still had boxes sitting around from their possessions that they had never taken with them, right? And so I said, how are we going to get him to understand that you can actually be comfortable here? And she's a very creative person. She said, how about we go through our kids' boxes and we bring some things in? And so the next morning we came in and we had a little stack for him. And when he came in saying, I'm so cold, I have to go home, we said, you need to go home, and all the things in this stack, you need to put all of them on in the order in which they're here. And he thought we were crazy. He was certain he needed to go home. But the next morning he came in and he said, I'm not cold. So that's a little bit what we're talking about when we're coming to an area that is so fundamentally different in some ways. It takes some time to learn the mechanisms to deal with it, but there is a lot of fun to be had in winter. It is beautiful when Hyde Park has the first snowfall, especially if it happens in the afternoon when the traffic does not get into the way. It is more beautiful than they can imagine now. There are lights everywhere on campus. There are lots of good things happening. And so a Chicago winter is an okay thing, even though the first time it may seem to be a little harsh. So I will stop talking at this point to answer any questions you may have. And of course, there may be questions that occur to you maybe after you've gone home and you're saying, here is something that the handout didn't tell me and that she didn't talk about in the session, it's always okay to send us an email message, and you will receive a lot more, and already have received a lot more additional contact information. So just like your student, don't worry whether you're asking the question of the right person. If it is not us who answers the question, we will connect you with the person who can answer and who can deal with whatever issue is ahead. So any questions you have?
I wanted to ask that during the study abroad, how does this whole visa system work? Because they're on the I-20, which I suppose that's the name, they've got the F1 visa. How does it work in those 3-4 months of campus? And do they continue to be enrolled at the college while on
Yeah.
visa?
Yeah, so we have a fairly large number of international students who go on study abroad at some point. They can be away from campus for up to 5 months. They retain their I-20, nothing changes in their status. They have to pay attention to the visa, and we always make sure if you're traveling out of the country, here is what you need to have. Make sure that your visa is valid, and if it is not, then make sure as soon as you get to your destination to apply. From the US visa immigration system, there are no issues with that. It goes very smoothly. What makes the matter complicated, the more countries you put in the mix, the more complicated the whole immigration situation becomes. Who needs a visa for another country is in part dependent on the home country, the citizenship of the student. And so the study abroad program is very well aware of that and guides students through that. So certain students, depending on their home country, will have to apply for a visa for the country where they do the study abroad program. But the immigration system here in the US, that is a very common thing, and there are no issues with that.
Super, thank you.
The immigration officer said that you get the I-20 form signed before you get for a location. So does the student have to approach you in November to sign it in case they're leaving in December? Or can they approach you in early December?
Yeah, so there is a travel signature space on the I-20 on the second page. There are 4 spaces for that. For newly incoming students, we already signed the first one. That is good for a year. So if the student has not gotten a new signature and more than a year has passed, the student can come to our office. It takes all of 2 minutes, so our front desk operation does a lot of these things on a walk-in basis, and it's very quick. At key travel times, so before the winter holiday and before summer break comes, we also set up stations in various places on campus where we have several of our advisors present, and students can come and get their travel signatures. It's not so uncommon that somebody forgets to get their travel signature. So I sometimes get a panicked call saying, I'm at the airport, I'm leaving for the summer, I don't have a travel signature, what do I do? If the student is outside of the country for enough time for us to mail a document to the student, we can do that. We don't push that information really hard. We're really trying to get them to come and get the signature up front. But if they leave the country and they haven't gotten the signature, it's not a disaster. We can work with them. Other questions?
Is the student allowed to provide online services, for example, online tutoring?
To provide it on campus. So the question was, can a student do something like online tutoring or work in a capacity like that on campus? Yes, on campus it's okay. They need to carry their I-20 at all times, and that's actually something that is true in the US because it's the key document that shows that the student is here lawfully. So, and you were asking if the student is from Canada, do they have to have their document every time? Yes, they need to have that document on them. They just don't need a visa like students from other countries would, but they have to have their I-20 on them, and it has to have the valid signature, meaning a signature within the past year. Yes, it always has to be the original one. So photocopies will not work. Sometimes somebody will say, well, can't you just email me an electronic version? No, it has to be the original. And there are actually requirements that you will always see our documents signed in blue. Law actually says we have to do that because that's a very easy, that used to be an easy way to distinguish a copy from an original. The government always needs a little time to catch up with current technology, which has overcome that, but that is still a rule, yeah.
And when they travel outside the US, or if they travel inside, do you recommend them to take everything, the passport, the I-9?
When they are traveling within the US, they must have their I-20. We discourage students from carrying their passport. It's such a valuable document. If it gets lost, it's really troublesome. We encourage students to make photocopies of all their documents, including their passport, and leave their passport in a safe place. So when they're in the US, they need their I-20, but they don't have to have their passport. When they travel outside of the US and they're going to come back in, then they have to have their passport, they have to have a valid visa, unless they're Canadian, and they have to have the I-20.
How strict is the timing for when the students have to leave or come back to campus? Sometimes the flights from overseas don't coincide with the times that they're allowed into their dorms and have to leave their dorms by. Are they able to stay an extra day from making a day earlier?
So I think there's a session with the housing program during this orientation program for you, and they'll talk about that somewhat. They have some solutions for that because some students stay here when a lot of students are leaving, and they can work within the house system to accommodate that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If they are traveling within the US, do they need this travel signature as well? Even if they go for a couple of days?
No, they don't. So as long as they're in the US, they're fine as long as they just carry their I-20. They have to have the travel signature when they leave and come into the country. The function of the travel signature is to confirm that everything that the document says is still correct and up to date. So it basically says to immigration authorities, yes, the student continues to be an international student in good standing.
Sorry, I didn't understand. The signature, is it valid for a year, or for instance, my daughter is Brazilian?
It's valid for a year.
So if she goes back for Christmas and when she comes back, she doesn't need a new.
She doesn't need it yet. Next summer, when she goes home, if she comes back when more than a year has passed, then she will need it. Mhm. In the back. Talk. All right. STEM fields. So students who are in a field of science, technology, engineering, or math, when they graduate, in addition to the OPT that normally gives them 12 months after graduation, they have an additional 24 months of employment authorization available. So a student who has 12 months of OPT approved and is employed has to then apply for an extension, and that has to be applied for in time to get the extension with the long processing time. So we say to students, it is really smart to apply for the extension 6 months before the initial OPT expires, and then a student has 24 months of employment available as long as the employer is in a US system called E-Verify, which is a verification system of employment authorization. And so students have that available after every level of education. So somebody who's in a STEM field can do 36 months of employment after the undergraduate degree, and could theoretically do 36 months of employment after a master's and another 36 months of employment after a PhD. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and it's a little further out. It doesn't really come into play until after a student has graduated and already has the additional 12 months of employment under OPT, but that is something that any of our students who are in STEM fields will want to take advantage of. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to know, I believe the STEM rules were revised recently, the different areas that are covered.
Yes.
And, do the students get advice as to whatever area they're in, does it come under STEM or not?
Yes, they actually, that is something when they are preparing to graduate, there's a lot of communication back and forth. And certainly when students are beginning to talk about OPT, we have a series of OPT workshops at the time of year when they need to start their application. And we walk them through what all is available, how it works. And then we assume that most students, after doing that workshop and after looking at our website, will need an appointment with an advisor because there is some complexity to that, and they need to talk through how everything should line up properly. So that's very common. Mhm.
What if the student loses the original I-20A within the US and when they've gone home?
If they lose the I-20, it's not that big a deal. We can replace it, and we can get it to the student, if need be, by FedEx. So depending on when the student loses the document, if a student finds that the document is lost and the student's on the way to the airport, that's going to be a problem. That may delay the flight, and that may cost a rescheduling fee. But generally speaking, since we control the I-20, when the student contacts us and says, I have lost my I-20, we can replace it fairly quickly. If the student is here, we can typically replace it within 2 or 3 days. The thing that we really want students to safeguard very carefully is their passport. That is really the much more difficult issue.
On the SAVIS online check-in, the student had to provide a phone number. What happens if the phone number changes? Because can it be updated on the SAVIS online record?
So one of the things that we're going to press your students very much to do is to use MyU Chicago, which is their portal into the university system. And they will actually use MyChicago for all sorts of things, for their class overviews, for registration, to see their grades. All sorts of things happen in MyU Chicago. And what also happens there is updating their information. So let's say they've been in the dorms for a couple of years and then they want to move off campus, or their phone number changes, or their email changes, anything of that nature. They go into MyU Chicago and they update it there. We get a daily data feed from that system, so we will see if something has changed, and we will then update it through our mechanisms in SEVIS. So the student never has to do anything with us about that, because obviously the rest of the university would want to know that there's a new phone number. So it's a centralized system that the student updates, and then we automatically get that. If anything flows over to us, let's say your student has dropped a course and is now not showing up as full-time enrolled, that also, every morning at 8 o'clock, we get all the data, and we will see that. And somebody will reach out to your student saying, we have a problem, we need to talk. And we will communicate about what is happening. Most likely, there are some changes underway that are perfectly fine, but we want to make sure that the student doesn't inadvertently slip out of status. And so we get a lot of data on a daily basis, and we would see that. Mm-hmm.
Students have handed passports into your office for safekeeping, or do they have to have them?
Now, with 4,500 students who we're sponsoring, for us to be responsible for those passports, it would, I think, not be as bad as the government being responsible for them, but it would not be terribly much better. So the students will have to, when they come to our office, we give them a document pouch, we give them some things, we say, keep all your important documents together. And so they should safeguard their passport. There are some settings in which they need an ID, and they may have to have their passport, and we say, as soon as that is done, put your passport in a safe place again. So unfortunately, we cannot do that. For one thing, we're not available 24/7, and so we have no facility to do that.
If a student forgot to register within the first 3 days to do the service registration,
Yeah, after a little while, we run some reports from our systems. We can see who has checked in, and we will send a reminder to those who haven't. On Thursday, I always say to the students, okay, who here has checked in? And almost all hands go up. And we will say, and if your hand didn't go up, we hope to see you in the next few days. So it's usually not a huge issue. There's just a lot happening, and sometimes the student didn't get around to it. But we'll see it in our systems. We'll remind them, so we will find them. Yeah. Right. You had, okay.
Besides passport, is there any local US ID that student can get, a state ID or something like that?
Unfortunately not. So earlier I said immigration and various other bureaucracies are connected. A student can get an ID if the student has a social security number. So this becomes a domino effect, right? A student cannot, an F1 student cannot get a social security number unless that student has secured employment. So, and that is something that usually does not happen for some time. So once a student has a social security number, then that student can obtain a state ID card. But that is the problem with that whole social security system, because it would be really helpful for our students to have ID cards. But that's the reason why they have to carry their passport for some purposes. The same thing, yeah, the same thing. So they, correct, they have to. So there is a system that allows them to get a temporary visitor's driver's license. That's a little bit complicated. They have to show that they're not eligible for a social security number, which is very easy to do. And then they can apply for the driver's license. It takes some time. And so that is the one identification they can get. But for pretty much anything else, they would have to have a social security number first.
Would you give us a little bit more information about the next IRS tax form which has to be filled out?
Okay. So taxes, such fun. We have a reporting date of April 15th typically for tax filings. Many of your students will not yet have anything to report. If they have no income that they would have to report, they still have to complete one form. It's called the Form 8843. It basically is the formal way to tell our tax authority that they have nothing to report. And it's pretty straightforward. They report when they have been in the country this year. They have to actually figure out how many days. They have to indicate their status. They give their individual information and so on. That has to be filed by the middle of June. We reach out to students repeatedly with email, and we have a software package that students go in, and that's a very ready-made software program meant for international students. One of the things they can do through that system is generate that form and then file it. If they actually have taxes to report, the software walks them through that as well. We provide tax workshops, so our payroll specialists in the university do workshops for the students. So we provide a lot of support. It tends to be a difficult thing to do because US students, when they come into the college, have never done their taxes before either. What do? They call mom and dad and say, would you please do my taxes, right? Unfortunately, you're not in a position to do that. And so, so we work with them, and usually it works pretty well. It's not terribly complicated at that level. It's just getting used to something that is so very bureaucratic. And it's, in a way, it's like the most boring homework assignment ever to have to do this. And so, so that's the challenge, not so much the difficulty of the thing. Who has not had a chance at a question? In the back. Could you speak up a little? I'm trapped behind the mic because they're recording this. There is storage provided by the house system, but I'm not. That is something that housing will have to answer, because it's my understanding that they've made some changes this year. So there is some storage for larger items. The kinds of things that they would want to access daily, those are probably things that they would keep with them in their room. But that would be a question to ask the house system. And if you have not been to their session yet, I would raise that with them. Yeah. And I realize the rooms are not terribly large, but there are a lot of other spaces in the buildings, and the dorms are quite different. And so So that is something, the longer-term storage is one thing, but something that's very short-term, I'm not sure of that.
Is there any universal date before that they have to file the taxes?
For when they have to report any income, the universal date sort of is April 15th. If they don't have to report income, it's June 15th. And they will get repeated reminders. So my earlier statement that if they pay attention to our email, they're going to be okay, that applies to this as well.
For students, is it worldwide income or is it US income?
US income, yeah.
My daughter is a student of OSC scholarship programs. So that scholarship is mean her income in US.
Yeah, yeah. And so she will receive a particular form from our payroll system that manages all of that, and she will have some reporting to do. And the information that students get from us is very detailed. We say, if this situation applies to you, then here's what you have to do. If this is your situation, then here's what you have to do. And so they do get a lot of help. The software is very intuitive and interactive. So the software will say, have you received a scholarship? It will ask questions about what kind of a scholarship. So it does not simply have students fill out forms, it asks questions, and then depending on how students answer those questions, then it populates the documents that need to be created. And so it is a very manageable system, and so students typically get through that fairly easily. It gets more complicated if the student has had employment and so on, then it gets a little bit more complex. But certainly in the beginning, the first year or two, it's very straightforward. So what happens is any payments that go to students that are taxable, a part of that is withheld and automatically goes to the tax authority, the IRS. And then in many instances, the student can show that, so there's a standard withholding rate for everybody. And in many instances, the student gets part of that back, and that's one of the nice things about doing the tax reporting, because you get some of the money back. And so there is one taxation process through the payment system, and then in the reporting that the student does, the opportunity to regain some of that. Those are the two pieces to that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to ask, now in the U-ship, the insurance,
Mm-hmm.
when the students try to set up their permanent account page, it does not, and put in the permanent mailing address and all of that, they cannot proceed further unless they have an SSI number or an ITIN number.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they get around that? Because obviously they need to set up the mailing in that account.
That is a really good question, and that I don't know. We typically, so what I know is that at this point, we have one staff member who does nothing but ITIN appointments, morning till evening. So we know that a significant number of the college students need to get their ITIN numbers very quickly. And it's my understanding that by the time they have to finalize their U-ship enrollment, that they have that ITIN application. So there are some processes for which in the university, if somebody does not yet have an ITIN, but can show that an ITIN application has been made, some processes go forward on the basis of that. So that is something, I can't remember whether there is an insurance session at this orientation today. Is there one?
There was, I think, upstairs.
Okay. And a lot of the information that you got today, the college will also send you afterwards by email. So, but I will ask that question and find out. Yeah, it's my understanding, we have not seen problems with this. So it's my understanding that the way we have the timeline set up are working, so students are not getting stuck with that. Mm-hmm. In the back.
In some countries, the US has a double taxation agreement.
Mm-hmm.
So is the
No, it has to be paid here, but there are so many tax treaties, depending on the country of the student and the details of the tax treaty, it works differently. So that is one of the things. There is a tax publication that shows the tax treaties, and it's monumental. And our payroll office is aware of what nationalities will generate what exemptions in the system. So that is very much their expertise. And so they're aware if there is a tax treaty, then this student's situation has to be managed differently. And what typically happens is that the withholding is still the same for everyone, but when the student does the tax reporting then next spring, the student shows the tax treaty, and that means the student potentially receives all of it back rather than a part, again, depending on what the details of the tax treaty are. Any more questions? All right, one more?
Working on campus for 20 hours, would that allow the students to get a social security number?
Yes. So if the student, let's say the student gets a job in the library or something like that, to be employed, the student needs a social security number and will get that number. And we walk them through that process. Yeah, so it's whatever the employment is with the university that requires that social security number. It makes them eligible. All right, it's been a pleasure to meet you. One of the things I want to assure you of, let me ask you this question. For how many of you is this the first student you're sending off to college? All right, that is scary, right? We're getting on a plane, we're leaving our child somewhere else in the world, and we're getting on a plane and we're going home. We will take very good care of them. We have thousands of them, and they will blossom, they will make a lot of connections, whether it's in the house system or the many events. They are so going 24/7 right now because they are making friends. By the time they step into the classroom next week, on the 26th, they will walk into the room and they will already find several people they know simply from everything they've done during orientation. They have a wonderful Dean of Students staff to support them, and the entire university is here to support them. So if there's one parting thing to tell your student before you leave is ask for help. When you have a question, talk to somebody, not only your friends, but talk to somebody who works for the university, and we can help them. And so we are fully poised to be their support and to make sure that they have an excellent experience both in the classroom and out of the classroom. So rest assured, I feel for you. I have sent children off to college. I know what that feels like. And so they will be okay. We'll see to that. Thank you for coming.